Welcome to Energy Unplugged, your go-to podcast focusing on the global energy transition. I'm Oliver Kerr, Aurora's Managing Director for North America. And today we have a very special, short and sweet episode for you. Over the last year, Aurora spent a lot of time thinking about modeling and supporting transactions in Alberta. And for my money, it's one of the most interesting power markets to follow right now, certainly one of the most interesting I've personally spent time covering over the last few years. And today, I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by none other than the Honourable Danielle Smith, Premier of Alberta. Premier Smith, thanks for taking the time today. A very warm welcome to the podcast.
Oh, my pleasure. Nice to talk to you, Oliver.
So I know we don't have a huge amount of time, but I do want to start with the big picture. So we have listeners from all around the world. If you had to paint a picture of Alberta in just a few words, how would you describe the province you're responsible for to a global audience?
Well, I would say that we are a premier open for business province. One of the main things that we did a few years ago to really send a message to the market that we wanted investment was to reduce our corporate income tax rate down to 8%. And the reason that is so significant is that it makes us, by a long shot, the best place to do business from a corporate tax perspective compared to any other province. We're 30% lower in the combined provincial federal rate when you compare across Canada. And we're actually lower than the combined corporate income tax rates of 44 US states as well. We have a healthcare system that is publicly funded, and so that allows for companies to defray a bit of the cost that they would normally have in providing benefits. We don't have a payroll tax, don't have a capital tax, don't have a sales tax. We've got some of the lowest personal income tax rates as well, so that allows for companies to be able to offer that as a value proposition for their employees as well. We've got some work to do on affordability. Electricity used to be one of our competitive advantages, and it ended up not being for the last couple of years. And so that's why we've put such a focus on examining the market, finding out what's not working, so that we can offer that value proposition again. When we had coal as our base fuel, we had long-term power purchase agreements where fuel could be essentially generated for 3 cents a kilowatt hour. And as we've added additional types of fuel to the grid, it's become more and more expensive. And it went out of control last year, where the floating rate was peaked up to 32 cents a kilowatt hour in August, and that didn't even include the cost of transmission and distribution and local access fees to pay municipalities. So we knew that was a signal of a major problem, and that we had to work diligently to fix it. To just put that into context, when I talked with some of the big energy producers who were on the floating rate last year, for instance, large forestry companies, they were operating between the hours of midnight and 4 a.m. because that was when they could get the cheapest power. And that's not what we want to provide. We want to be able to provide cost-effective power across the board, no matter the time of day. And so a lot of the changes that you may have read about that we're making to the market are with that end in mind. And we're making some good progress. We're part of the way there.
No, I think that's really interesting because I think, Alberta in many ways is built on oil and gas, but it's also been a big success story when it comes to decarbonisation in the power sector. As you mentioned, we've gone from over 50% coal 10 years ago to the last plant, Genesee, shuttering earlier this summer. I suppose the question in terms of what's next is, as you know, in all power markets, there's this fundamental need to get the balance right between decarbonisation, but also affordability to consumers and system reliability. So do you think Alberta is on the path to getting that balance right now?
I think we are. I think that there was aspirationally some notion that you could replace 5,000 megawatts of coal power with 5,000 megawatts of solar and wind and have the same amount of energy. And I think in practice, what has happened, especially in our market, is that wind, as great a resource as we have, if you look back on its reliability over the course of a year, it operates about 33% of the time. Solar, again, we've got great solar resources, but we also have a less intensity of solar in our winter months, and we have shorter days in winter. So solar can be relied on about 10% of the time. So if you think about that, you need something to back up wind and solar when they don't work. And I think perhaps batteries will get better and better over time. Right now, I'm told that You essentially can get 1 or 2 hours of battery backup. And so we need to be looking at ways of accommodating that intermittent power. So there's a couple ways you can do it. Well, the way we have done it in our market is that we have natural gas peaker plants. And so when solar and wind come on in a rush, they get the first right to bid into the market. And then when they come off in a rush, that's when the peaker plants end up surging up. And it was working not so badly when we still had baseload power of coal. But now that we've got the baseload power of coal off the grid, it's this type of market isn't working at all. There's just too long a delay, and there's too much unreliability when solar and wind come off. And we've ended up with something in the order of about 15 grid alerts that have happened over the last 18 months to 2 years. And that's not good for anyone to have that kind of intermittency. We certainly don't want to be in a practice as we had to in January when it was below -30, 5 o'clock at night. We had no solar, no wind, and we had reached the peak of what our natural gas was able to deliver. So we had to do an emergency call for people to turn off their unnecessary lights and stop cooking dinner and generally just get us through those evening hours, because you can't just tell people, well, let's wait till the sun comes up at 9 a.m. the next morning. Not when it's that kind of temperature, because people die in -30 conditions. And it's been shown in Texas that actually did happen. When they lost their power grid, over 300 people did die. So I take that very seriously, that it isn't an academic argument in climates like ours, where we routinely get +30 in the summer and routinely get -30 or worse in the winter. We have to have reliability and affordability be number one, while looking for ways over time, as technology becomes available, to reduce the CO2 profile.
I think that's exactly right. And, it's the first priority of anyone managing a power system is to ensure reliable power. And, I'm based in Texas, and February 2021 was fairly horrific. So this is a matter of life and death, like you say. I'm curious how you see the role of markets versus government in sort of solving some of these issues around system reliability. So, markets are generally pretty efficient at allocating resources. One view of the world is, it's the role of government to set up the market structure. Then developers, investors will respond to the resulting price signals. You've spoken in the past about things like government-owned dispatchable generation if nobody else is willing to build it. I suppose the question is, how much are you willing to step in as government if the market isn't delivering the outcomes that you want?
Well, look, I mean, yeah, if the market wanted to deliver what the market wanted to deliver, we probably would have stayed on coal, because that is the most abundant and most reliable type of power. And increasingly with supercritical plants, they've been able to get a reasonably good emissions profile. In fact, I'm told it's a little bit easier to capture emissions from a coal-fired stream than a natural gas stream, which is kind of interesting. But that's part of a government decision, is to have said that that phasing out coal was a priority. And so we phased it out really quickly. Initially, they had talked about 2030, and we ended up phasing out faster. And so as a result of that, the happy consequences, emissions have reduced 53% off our power grid. So that's one example of a government stepping in to make a decision that the market might not otherwise have done. Although there has been some instances with natural gas being so low where the economics make sense to switch away from coal into natural gas. So I would say that is a movement that parties across the spectrum have embraced in our country. The second part of the issue, though, is you can't have a market that is designed for baseload coal power apply to intermittent solar and wind. And that's the problem that we find ourselves in, is that I think with coal-fired electricity, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but generally speaking, you don't amp it up and amp it down again. When you've put coal on, that is your baseload power that operates pretty well 24 hours a day, unless it has to come down for maintenance. I think you can slightly power it down, but generally speaking, that is your base. And then everything else fits in around that, depending on what the pressures are in the system. So when you've thrown out that and you say, okay, well, we're going to give wind and solar the priority coming on, now you're left with all of our electric system operators looking at the at the temperature charts and the weather charts and trying to predict the wind, trying to predict the sun. And it's very stressful for them, because with our peaker plants, as I understand it, it can take about an hour for them to be able to be called into service. And that can be the difference between having reliability or having shutdowns. So there's a few things that we've realized we had to do. One is that we have to add some batteries to the actual grid as opposed to particular installations, because that will allow us to manage. If the battery power right now is good for about an hour, that's actually a pretty good addition to our power grid, because when wind and solar come off as a surprise, and it takes an hour for most of the peaker plants to be able to come on stream, that battery backup can provide a little bit of that short-term bridge. So we're expecting that is going to make a difference. We needed to do that as government. We needed to regulate that, and we needed to give some direction to the electric system operator to do that. And I think that's going to be a positive. When it comes to investing in natural gas, unfortunately, the market is sending the signal that they do not want to invest in anything other than fully decarbonized energy. That's one of the reasons why we had to take a pause last year. Is we had something in the order of 23,000 megawatts of power proposed for our grid, and virtually all of it was solar and wind. Well, just based on what I've said earlier, if wind only works a third of the time and solar only works 10% of the time, you simply have to bring on other types of backup power at the same time as you're bringing on solar and wind, so that you can avoid the reliability problems. And we weren't seeing that. So we've sent a signal to the market with the pause, and indicated to the private sector energy investors that we're open for business on natural gas. We're fighting the federal government on what we think are aggressive, unrealistic emissions reductions targets by 2035. But I think generally speaking, we believe a 2050 target for decarbonization should be possible with new technological advances. But we're not there yet. We have to get there with the iterative steps that are taken every time you develop new technology. So that's the context for why we said we'd be prepared to be that generator of last resort if the market does not respond. And there's a reason why the market is not responding, and it's because of federal interference. The laws, as they were initially put forward by the federal government, said that the natural gas on the grid had to be 95% decarbonized by 2035. That's a great aspirational target. But in talking with members of the industry, the current amount of carbon capture that we have in some of our existing plants is 65% decarbonized. They think they can get up pretty quickly to 75%. And there are even some telling me 85%. But no one is going to invest today in an asset that probably normally has a 20 or 30 or 40-year lifespan if they're basically going to be told to shut off in 2035, or on pain of your executives going to jail or being fined. And that's how the legislation is written. That's part of the reason why it's federal interference that have interfered with our market, interfered with market signals, interfered with private investment. And as a result, we're finding ourselves in a position where we have to de-risk those investments potentially. And we're prepared to do that. That's the reason. We want to maintain a private market. We think, generally speaking, it's worked really well for our province. It's allowed us to keep up with our substantial growth. We've got substantial growth that we're still contemplating, at least a doubling of our fuel needs by 2050. And those kinds of decisions, if they're just politicized, if it's just taxpayers making the decision to underwrite those investments, as it is in most jurisdictions, sometimes there's underinvestment that happens. And if you look across our country, you'll find that most of the full public utility markets are constrained on power, and they're having to make decisions about, do we export or don't we? Do we invest in more multi-billion-dollar projects or don't we? Do we allow the private sector to come in or don't we? Do we tell industrial investment, sorry, you got to get in the queue, we don't have enough power for you? Do you tell data centers and AI, well, we'll let you in, but be prepared, we're going to turn you off if we get power constrained? We don't want any of those problems that come with a public utility. We want to maintain the ability to make Alberta the very best place to invest in all types of power.
I'm struck by how similar the conversation is to here in Texas. I think, since Storm Uri, policymakers here have been looking at many of the things that you just mentioned, rising load, retiring thermal generation, huge amounts of wind and solar, looking to come online. They see the need for dispatchable generation, but there's not much of it coming through in interconnection queues looking to connect. And a big part of the solution here has been making sure that the price signals are there to make sure that there is that incentive for investment. More generally, though, I think Texas does still remain a very attractive place to invest in renewables. It's probably easier to build here than anywhere else in the US. In Alberta, the moratorium has been lifted now. We work with dozens of developers and investors, and even with it lifted, I think it's fair to say that there's some degree of concern that there's more policy to come that could undermine their investment. So I suppose my question is, what would you say to those who are perhaps putting capital investments on hold in response to policy uncertainty? Is Alberta still open for business for renewables specifically?
Well, yes, we are. And I think we will be also the destination for more renewables investment than any other province, because we do have a private market that is open to all participants. The issue for the moratorium, I explained one part of it, which was the intermittency and the issues that we were having on managing our power grid, and the fact that we were not having an equivalent amount of backup coming on stream. There were a couple of other issues, though. In our market, we have a way of mediating the surface and subsurface landowner rights through giving compensation to our landowners, and by having some guarantee that when the installation is over with, there's going to be a company left holding the bag to clean that up. And we don't have a similar environment for solar and wind. You just have to rely on the company being a good actor. And it becomes complicated now that we're a little more of a mature market. We're watching solar and wind change hands to different players. And we certainly don't want at the end of that for our landowners to be left with, okay, well, you know what, the solar panels don't work anymore. I can't afford to replace them. We're just going to leave this installation the way it is, or with wind turbines as well when they need to be replaced, because it's substantial to be able to remove those installations. I've been given a quote, especially since there's something like 800 cubic meters of cement at the base of each of these wind towers, that it would potentially cost $1 million for each one. And a typical solar farm or wind farm is now 50 different towers. That's a massive reclamation cost. So we wanted to make sure that there was at least some kind of bond, so that by the end of life, if those installations need to be removed or replaced, that there is a company that is putting money aside to be able to make that happen. So that was one part of it. The other part we heard was that it was pretty well, whoever puts in an application, it's an automatic yes, no matter what the landowner says, no matter what the municipality says. And we've ended up with a couple of problems there. In one case, we actually had to re-engineer our runway in Oyen because our fixed-wing medevac services couldn't fly in because a turbine was built too close to the runway. In another case, I'm hearing of landowners who aren't allowed to spray their property anymore because their neighbors put up wind turbines, and now they're not allowed to do aerial spraying. And that's not fair, and that's not right. Like, you're not allowed to use your property in a way that interferes with the public need that we have in providing services, or your private neighbors' ability to enjoy their property. So we wanted to create some setback areas around that, so that we have some rules, so that we have better ability for landowners to intervene and municipalities to intervene to raise their concern. And then we also knew that there were major installations being proposed among our beautiful mountain parks area. And it is not unusual to have some rules around how much space you've got to give as a buffer zone when you're putting those in. I mean, part of what happens when you put up wind turbines in a windy area is you have to be mindful of migratory birds, and we don't want to be putting them right next to our mountain parks, which are UNESCO heritage sites in some cases, as well as having an interruption with migratory birds and bats. So we have to be mindful of where we're putting those things. So that was the other reason we put in a 35-kilometer buffer zone. I think they've got something similar in the UK. And it mostly is just to protect our beautiful mountain parks area, which we've got, 3 national parks: Jasper, Banff, and Waterton. And so I think you should, that gives an indication of how precious we look at those resources. And that's also a major tourism resource too. So again, you don't want to interfere with the ability of our tourism development, which we're hoping to double in the next couple of years. So I think we found the right balance on all of those things. I know that there was probably a little bit of frustration. The other thing I'd say, though, is that we're putting the emphasis on reliability. And I think that solar and wind we'll have to sort of think through what that means. Does that mean that when they come to us and say, hey, I have a 100 megawatt installation, that they should come to us and say, we have a 100 megawatt installation that can operate all the time because we've worked out our own arrangement with a peaker backup or a battery backup or a compressed air backup or a pump storage backup, that we're going to be making sure that there's a reliability benefit. And so that hasn't been the case before. I mean, solar and wind have basically come on and left it to the electric system operator to figure it out when they don't show up. So that we're going to sort through how that will actually look. But when the new market design comes on, you'll see that there is going to be, rather than have the priority to intermittency, there'll be a priority to reliability with a day-ahead market. And so I'll be interested to see how wind and solar are respond to that. That is going to be probably the next major change. The final one is that part of the issue that we've had in our escalating transmission costs is that it costs a lot of money to build hundreds of kilometers of power lines at the highest level to accommodate a tiny installation in a remote community. And so we'll be looking to send some signal that locate closer to the transmission that already exists, because there'll be a larger share of the cost that all installations are going to have to bear the further they locate away from existing transmission infrastructure. It's just gotten too expensive. Our transmission and distribution charges are now something like 80% of the power bill. And I've been told in other jurisdictions it's the reverse, that you'd normally expect to pay a much smaller portion for distribution and transmission. And I think it's because of this massive overbuild that has occurred on transmission lines, because they've been cited here, there, and everywhere. So we're looking at developing a proposal that will reward those firms for locating closer to the existing infrastructure. Those would be the couple of the main things coming.
We talked a lot about reliability. So affordability is also something your government has taken very seriously. You appointed a minister for affordability and utilities. We've seen a big effort to curb so-called economic withholding. So I suppose, are you happy with the outcome? Is there more work to be done there?
Well, I hope that we've sent the message that economic withholding is not appropriate. I'll tell you what happens. This is sort of the other unintended consequence of giving intermittent power like wind and solar the priority. What happens is, in our market, they basically bid in at the lowest possible value, which is zero. And so every other player says, wait a minute, I can't produce power at zero, so I'm just going to hold back my power until the electric system operator has a higher price that they're willing to pay me. And in practice, up until 2020, and maybe it was the stabilizing influence of coal, it never got too high. The market surveillance administrator who gives us advice said, you know what, we've looked at this, it's not really a big deal. And as soon as they issued that report, it became a very, very big deal. And to the point where we could actually observe what was happening is that companies were withholding power far past the point where they should have, which spiked up the amount that we paid for everything. And it came to a real head last August when we ended up with power prices of 32 cents a kilowatt hour. So we indicated to the market players, this isn't going to be allowed anymore. And we enabled some changes through legislation so that they're not permitted to do that anymore. And I gathered, just talking to my officials, it just came into effect this month. And so with the things that we're doing, we're bringing on more natural gas. We're the moratorium, or the pause has been lifted on wind and solar. We've given some more certainty to the market. And we're now regulating our what we had called our regulated rate option. We're calling it now the rate of last resort. We're signaled that we're bringing down prices for local access fees that municipalities charge. So there's a confluence of things that we've done, and our variable rate at the moment is now ranging between 10 and 12 cents a kilowatt hour. So it's 1/3 what it was around this time last year. And I think a lot of that is the the signal that we sent to the industry that we're just simply not going to tolerate the withholding of power to spike rates for consumers. So is there more that needs to be done? Maybe. we hope that the market actors now understand the kind of system that we want. We want it to remain a system that is open for investment, where we'll be able to get all players coming into the market, but we simply can't have any players gaming the system and hurting consumers. That's part of the reason why it's affordability and utilities. We're putting affordability at the front. It's got to be an essential part of the continued Alberta advantage that we have.
I think another reform that's currently on the table that will help a whole lot with economic withholding is raising the offer price cap. I think, one of the reasons people need to withhold capacity in order to raise prices is that when prices do spike, that they were limited at 1,000 Canadian dollars. I think raising that offer price cap, allowing prices to reflect the true value of scarcity, will certainly help with economic withholding.
Well, look, and we're also interested in expanding our interties, because we'd still like to be able to have a surplus of power generated here so that we don't get into those constraint conditions. And we want to be able to have an Alberta first approach. Provide your market, provide what we need first, and then you're free to export to the US. Because down in California, I think they go up to $2,000. Dollars a megawatt. And that's part of the calculation that BC does. So I think you'll see us increasing our interties with Saskatchewan, British Columbia, and Montana, and overbuilding here so that we have the ability to sell into those high value markets without hurting our own customers.
Excellent. And just finally, when you look to other technologies that could play a role in the long term beyond some of those that we've discussed already, what are you most excited about? And to what extent is the government willing to support things like CCS, like SMRs, and that sort of thing?
We're excited about all of them. I mean, we just came through a major festival that we have. It's nothing like what you have in Houston. I gather there's a 3-week festival of Stampede. We have a 10-day festival, which attracts people from around the world. But what was really interesting is almost every conversation I found myself having was about electricity and AI and data centers. And so there are potentially tens of billions of dollars of investment as long as those companies are able to get reliable power. So my suggestion to them was, come to us and bring your own power source with you. This is one of the advantages that we've had of having a private sector power market, is that no one has to wait around for us to produce the power for them. Our oil sands development, for instance, they had behind the fence or behind the meter, people call it different terms. So they were able to develop their own source for electricity. And then when they realized that they developed more electricity than they needed, we built transmission lines so they could feed our grid and provide some stability. So that's the model that I'm suggesting to the data center guys. Do the same thing. Develop a partnership with someone who can generate your own power behind the fence, behind the meter. And then if you produce more than you need, we'd be happy to have you sell to us. And that, I think, creates the value proposition that industry needs. They need the reliability. They don't want to be shut off if there's constraint. But if they're the ones who are the power source and they're able to help us out, I think that that's going to be perfect. We're a colder climate, so you need less power to be able to cool those kinds of centers. We've got lots of water, we've got lots of natural gas, and we've got some of the best pore space on the planet. I think we're second only to Russia in the amount of pore space capacity that we have. We've got carbon capture that we've already deployed at scale. We've got all of our pore space mapped out with new trunk lines being contemplated to be built. We've got a model for CCUS that provides a 12% refundable tax credit to anyone who invests in carbon capture technology. So I think that's going to be the first option, is that there'll be natural gas with carbon capture to be able to facilitate that type of growth. And then as the technology gets perfected, maybe it will get to 100%. That would be amazing. But if it doesn't, then the next iteration will very likely be some kind of nuclear rollout. We're through Emissions Reduction Alberta, which is one of our companies that takes in money from those who are large producers of CO2. We use those dollars to then fund projects. One of the ones we're funding is a study for small modular reactors being deployed at some of our industrial sites like Synovus. We've also supported geothermal, and one of our companies, Ever, is now deployed in Germany as a geothermal company. That is probably going to be of higher value also. I hear all kinds of potential options for pump storage, and that may be how we stabilize the solar and wind installations that come onto the grid. I've heard of two major projects being proposed, and I just recently heard about compressed air, that you can actually store compressed air in some of our vacant pipelines as a way of having a different type of battery backup. So I would say we're enthusiastic about all of it, and that's the beautiful thing about having a private market, is I don't have to decide as a politician what we're going to say yes or no to, and the bureaucracy doesn't have to decide what to say yes or no to. It's going to be up to the entrepreneurs to say, hey, we think we can do this, and go through the approval process. And as long as they've got a private sector backing and they're mindful that we are trying to decarbonize by 2050, I would say that we should continue to be the destination for all types of power generation in our province.
Well, I know you have an extremely busy schedule, so I think that's a great place on which to end. So Premier Smith, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Oliver. I'm coming down to Austin to meet with your governor. So we had a little bit of a bet over the playoffs. And so I'm looking forward to meeting him in person. And so I'll be in Austin enjoying your beautiful state. So thank you so much for talking to me today.
That was Oliver Kerr, Aurora's Managing Director for North America, talking to the Honorary Danielle Smith, Premier of Alberta. Thanks for listening to Energy Unplugged. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to follow or subscribe to the podcast via whatever platform you use.